Smoke curled out from under the kitchen door, and 3 maids were screaming in the corridor before Eleanor Hartwell had even set down her travel bag. She had arrived at Raythorn Hall only minutes earlier, soaked from the rain, expecting a quiet welcome and a chance to explain why she had come. Instead, she found chaos. A young hall boy ran past her shouting for water. A pot had caught fire on the old iron stove, and the 2 kitchen maids nearby were too frightened to do anything but shriek and back away from the flames. Eleanor did not think. She dropped her bag, grabbed the heavy woolen cloth hanging by the door, and threw it directly over the burning pot, smothering the flames in one firm motion. She pressed down hard, holding it in place until the smoke thinned and the danger passed. The maid stared at her, stunned into silence. "Open that window," Eleanor said calmly, pointing to the far wall. "Let the smoke out before anyone chokes on it." One of the maids obeyed without question, too shaken to argue. The other simply stood there, hand over her mouth, staring at the stranger who had just walked in off the road and taken charge of a room she had never seen before in her life. That was how Eleanor Hartwell arrived at Raythorn Hall. Not with a curtsy, not with an introduction, but with quick hands and a clear head in the middle of a small disaster that nobody else in the house seemed able to stop. A tall man appeared in the doorway moments later, drawn by the noise. He wore a dark coat, plain and unadorned, and his expression was unreadable. His eyes moved from the smoking pot to the woman standing over it, soot on her hands, rain still dripping from her hair. "Who are you?" he asked, "and why are you in my kitchen?" Eleanor straightened her shoulders, even though her hands were shaking now that the danger had passed. "My name is Eleanor Hartwell. I believe I am expected. I wrote to you 3 weeks ago about the position you advertised." The man's jaw tightened. The position for a wife who can manage a household. "Yes. You arrived to find my kitchen on fire." "It is not on fire any longer," Eleanor said. "It was a small flame in a neglected pot, likely left too long over the heat by someone in a hurry. It is out now and no one was hurt." "That is what matters." He studied her for a long moment, the way a man studies something he cannot quite place. Eleanor had expected coldness from the advertisement itself, which had made no mention of affection or courtship, only practical need. She had not expected to meet him in the middle of a crisis, and she suspected he had not expected to meet her that way either. "I am Alastair Raythorn," he said finally. "This is my home, though you would not know it from the state it is currently in." "I gathered as much," Eleanor said, glancing at the 2 maids still huddled by the window. "Is it always like this?" "More often than I would like to admit." He did not smile, he did not offer warmth. But something in his voice had softened just slightly, as though the fire, small as it was, had told him something about her that 100 polite letters never could have. Eleanor had not come to Raythorn Hall out of romantic hope. She had come because her father was ill, the debts on their small home were mounting, and there were no other paths open to a woman of her modest birth who needed steady wages and a roof that would not be taken from her within the month. She had grown up helping in her aunt's inn, learning to cook, to manage accounts, to settle disputes between tired workers before they turned into something worse. It was not the life of a lady, but it had given her skills that no fine young woman raised only for parties and needlework would ever possess. She had read the Duke's advertisement in a newspaper left behind by a traveler passing through her village. It had been strange, almost blunt, asking for a woman capable of managing a household of 50 servants, someone practical rather than romantic, someone who would not expect affection as part of the arrangement. Most women who saw such a notice would have been offended by its coldness. Eleanor had seen only opportunity. Now, standing in his kitchen with smoke still hanging faintly in the air, she wondered if she had misjudged what she was walking into. "Come with me," Alastair said. "We should speak properly away from all this." He led her out of the kitchen and down a long corridor. Eleanor noticed things as they walked: a rug with a torn corner that no one had bothered to mend, a window with a cracked pane patched with paper instead of glass, portraits on the walls slightly crooked, as though no one had straightened them in years. The house was grand in its bones, built with the kind of care that spoke of old wealth and old pride, but it had been left to decline, piece by piece, like something no one wanted to look at too closely. They reached a study, sparsely furnished, with papers stacked in uneven piles across the desk. Alistair gestured to a chair, and Alina sat, folding her damp hands in her lap. "Tell me honestly," he said, taking his own seat across from her, "why a woman with your evident composure has come all this way to answer an advertisement that offers no promises beyond wages and shelter." Alina considered lying, softening the truth into something more flattering, but something about the bluntness of the question made her choose honesty instead. "Because I need the position, Your Grace. My father is unwell, and the small income we have will not last much longer. I saw your advertisement, and unlike most such notices, it did not ask for beauty or connections. It asked for someone capable of running a household. I am capable. I have managed accounts, settled arguments among tired staff, and kept a kitchen running through busier seasons than I imagine yours has ever seen, even at its grandest." "You are very confident." "I have had to be." He leaned back slightly, studying her again. 50 servants live and work on this estate, Miss Hartwell. Not 50 polite servants who wish to please their employer. 50 people divided by old grudges, old loyalties, and years of neglect on my part, which I will not pretend did not happen. My last housekeeper left after a month. The one before her 2 weeks. You do not know what you are asking to walk into." "I walked into a kitchen fire within minutes of arriving," Alina said. "I think I have a fair idea." For the briefest moment, something flickered across his face that might have been the shadow of amusement. It vanished as quickly as it appeared. "There are conditions," he said. "This is not a courtship, Miss Hartwell. I require someone to bring order to this house, to manage the staff, to see that the estate functions as it should. In exchange, you will have security, a fair wage, and eventually, if the arrangement suits us both, a marriage that offers you a stable place in this world. I will not pretend to offer affection I do not have to give." Alina met his eyes steadily. "I did not come here seeking affection, Your Grace. I came seeking work I can do well, and a chance to build something stable for myself and my father. If that is the arrangement you are offering, I accept it." He nodded slowly, as though her answer confirmed something he had already suspected. "Very well, you may begin on a trial basis. 1 month. If at the end of that month you have brought some order to this household, we will discuss the matter further. If not, I will provide you with a fair sum for your trouble and safe passage home." "That is more than fair," Alina said. "There is one more thing," Alistair added, and for the first time his voice carried something heavier, something guarded. "There is a room in this house you are not to enter. The old kitchen in the west wing has been closed for many years. It remains locked, and it will stay that way. I do not wish to discuss the reasons. I simply ask that you respect the boundary." Alina's curiosity stirred immediately, though she kept her expression calm. "Understood, Your Grace. Mrs. Prout will show you to your quarters and introduce you to the staff tomorrow morning. Tonight, rest. You have already had an eventful arrival." As Alina rose to leave, she glanced back at him once. He had already turned his attention to the papers on his desk, his posture rigid, his expression closed again, as though the brief crack she had glimpsed earlier had never existed at all. She wondered what kind of grief could make a man seal off an entire room of his own home rather than face whatever memory lived inside it. Whatever it was, she thought, it would have to wait. She had 50 servants to win over, a house in disrepair to mend, and only 1 month to prove that she was exactly the woman his advertisement had asked for, even if he had not expected her to prove it by putting out a fire before she had even removed her coat. Outside, the rain continued to fall against the tall windows of Raythorn Hall, and somewhere deep in the west wing, behind a door no one dared to open, an old kitchen sat frozen in silence, waiting. Morning arrived with a bell that rang far too early for Alina's liking, though she rose at once, dressed quickly, and made her way downstairs before anyone could accuse the new arrival of laziness. She found Mrs. Prout waiting at the bottom of the staircase, arms crossed, Her gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin of her face into a permanent frown. "So you are the one who put out the fire," Mrs. Prout said, without any greeting at all. "Word travels fast in this house, Miss Hartwell, faster than sense most days." "I only did what needed doing," Alina replied, keeping her tone even. "Yes, well, there will be plenty more that needs doing, and I doubt you will manage half of it before you pack your bags and leave, same as the others." Alina said nothing to that. She had expected resistance, and she suspected that arguing with Mrs. Prout on her very first morning would accomplish nothing except confirming whatever low opinion the woman had already formed. "Show me the house," Alina said instead. "All of it. I would rather see the trouble myself than hear about it second-hand." Mrs. Prout's eyebrows rose slightly, as though she had expected excuses rather than requests, but she turned and led the way without further argument. What Alina saw over the following hours confirmed everything the Duke had warned her of, and more. The house was enormous, wings branching in every direction, and the 50 servants who kept it running were split into groups that barely spoke to one another. The kitchen staff resented the stable hands for eating better food than they were given. The upstairs maids looked down on the laundry workers, who in turn complained that no one respected the labor of scrubbing linens by hand from dawn until dusk. Wages were paid late, when they were paid in full at all, and more than one servant admitted quietly, when Mrs. Prout was out of earshot, that they stayed only because they had nowhere else to go. Alina listened to all of it. She did not promise sweeping changes on her first day, knowing that promises meant nothing to people who had heard too many of them broken already. Instead, she asked questions. She wrote things down in a small notebook she had brought from home, the same one she had once used to track supplies and accounts at her aunt's inn. By midday, she had learned the name of every servant she encountered, a detail that seemed to surprise several of them. A young hall boy named Peter, no older than 12, had been assigned tasks far beyond his years simply because there was no one else to give them to. An older cook, Mrs. Whitfield, ran the working kitchen with quiet exhaustion, having been promised help for months that never arrived. A maid named Beatrice, gentle and watchful, seemed to notice everything happening in the house but said little, as though she had learned long ago that speaking up changed nothing. It was Beatrice who Alina found herself speaking with longest, during a quiet moment while the other servants were occupied elsewhere. "You are different from the others who came before," Beatrice said, folding linens with practiced hands. "They wanted to give orders. You want to understand first." "Orders without understanding rarely work," Alina said. "I learned that a long time ago." Beatrice glanced around, then lowered her voice. "Be careful with Mrs. Prout. She has run this house a long time, since before the old Duchess passed. She does not take kindly to anyone she believes is trying to replace her." Alina's ears caught on the mention of the old Duchess, though she kept her expression neutral. "I have no wish to replace anyone. I only wish to help." "That may not matter to her," Beatrice said. "Grief makes people strange sometimes. She was fond of the Duchess, very fond." Before Alina could ask more, footsteps approached, and Beatrice fell silent, returning her attention to the linens as though the conversation had never happened. The wage dispute came to a head that very afternoon, sooner than Alina had expected. A group of stable hands, tired of being paid weeks late while the household staff received their wages on time, confronted Mrs. Prout directly in the courtyard, voices raised, tempers rising with every passing minute. Alina arrived just as the argument threatened to turn ugly, with one of the younger stable hands shouting that he would leave that very night if things did not change. She stepped between them before Mrs. Prout could respond with the sharp words already forming on her lips. "Enough," Alina said, loud enough to cut through the noise but calm enough not to add fuel to it. "Shouting in the courtyard will not fix anyone's wages. Come with me, all of you who are owed payment. We will settle this properly with the accounts in front of us, not with raised voices." The stable hands hesitated, clearly unused to being spoken to directly rather than dismissed. But something in Alina's tone, steady and unshaken, convinced them to follow her instead of walking out the gate. Inside the estate office, Elinor spread out the ledgers Mrs. Prout reluctantly provided and began working through them line by line. The problem, she quickly discovered, was not a lack of money but a lack of organization. Payments had been recorded haphazardly. Some servants paid twice by accident while others were missed entirely for weeks at a time. It took the better part of the afternoon, but by evening, Elinor had reworked the entire system, ensuring every servant received exactly what they were owed, with a clear record going forward so the same confusion would not happen again. Word of this spread through the household faster than the story of the kitchen fire had the day before. By nightfall, servants who had barely looked at Elinor that morning were nodding to her in the corridors, offering small gestures of respect that had nothing to do with her position and everything to do with what she had actually done. Mrs. Prout, for her part, said nothing about the incident, though Elinor caught her watching from a distance more than once, her expression unreadable, somewhere between suspicion and something that might, with enough time, become respect. That night, unable to sleep after such a long and eventful day, Elinor decided to walk the halls quietly, familiarizing herself with the layout of the house she now called home, however temporarily. She moved carefully, careful not to disturb the sleeping household, until she found herself in the west wing, a part of the house she had not yet properly explored. It was there, at the end of a long, dim corridor, that she saw him. Alistair stood before a heavy wooden door, unlit candle in hand, simply staring at it in the darkness. He did not move, did not reach for the handle, only stood there as though the door itself held some terrible weight he could not bring himself to face. Elinor recognized the door at once from the way Mrs. Prout had steered her away from that corridor earlier that day, refusing to answer any questions about what lay beyond it. She stepped back quietly before he could notice her, retreating into the shadows of the corridor, though the image stayed with her long after she returned to her own room. A man who could handle the running of an entire estate, who spoke with such cold command in his study, standing alone in the dark before a locked door, unable to open it. The next morning, she asked Beatrice about it as gently as she could while they worked together preparing linens for the day. "The old kitchen," Beatrice said quietly, glancing toward the door of the room as though the walls themselves might be listening. "No one speaks of it. The Duke ordered it sealed the day the old Duchess passed, and it has not been opened since. 10 years now, I believe." "What happened to her?" Elinor asked. Beatrice's expression grew troubled. That kitchen was her favorite place in the whole house. She loved to cook, if you can believe that, a duchess spending her afternoons among pots and flour like any ordinary woman. She fell ill very suddenly and passed within days. The Duke was traveling when it happened. He was not here. Some say he blames the house itself for taking her while he was away, though I think the truth is simpler and sadder than that. "What do you mean?" "I think he blames himself," Beatrice said quietly, "for not being here when she needed him most. And I think that kitchen holds more of her memory than any portrait or grave could, which is exactly why he cannot bear to open the door." Elinor said nothing for a long moment, turning the information over in her mind. She thought of the way he had stood before that door in the darkness, unmoving, and understood suddenly that the coldness she had witnessed in him was not the absence of feeling at all, but the presence of a grief so heavy he did not know how to carry it any other way. She resolved, quietly and without announcing her intentions to anyone, that she would learn more about that kitchen before her trial month was through, whatever the cost of asking such questions might turn out to be. For now, there was a household to manage, 50 servants still divided by old wounds, and a wage system to finish repairing before the week's end. Elinor Hartwell had not come to Raythorn Hall to solve every mystery hidden behind its locked doors. But she was beginning to understand that solving the mystery of the house, and solving the mystery of the man who owned it, might turn out to be one and the same task. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, and by the time Elinor finished reading it aloud to Mrs. Prout in the estate office, she understood exactly why the color had drained from the older woman's face. Lord Edmund Carow, a distant cousin of the Duke, and a man with considerable influence among the family's connections, was announcing his intention to visit Raythorn Hall within the week, along with 3 other guests of standing. The letter made no secret of its true purpose beneath the polite language. Edmund had long believed the estate would have been better managed under his own care, and he had made no secret in wider circles of his opinion that Alastair, grieving and withdrawn as he had become, was letting a once great house fall into ruin. This visit was not a friendly one. It was an inspection, dressed up as courtesy. 6 days, Mrs. Prout said, staring at the letter as though it might change if she looked at it long enough. 6 days to prepare a house for guests who are coming here specifically to find fault with it. Then we have 6 days to give them nothing to find, Eleanor said. Mrs. Prout looked at her sharply. You do not understand what is at stake, Miss Hartwell. If Lord Carrow returns to the family with tales of neglect and disorder, he could use it against the Duke in ways that go beyond gossip. There are questions of trusteeship, of whether the Duke is fit to manage the estate at all without oversight. It has happened to other houses before this one. Eleanor felt the weight of what that meant settle over her immediately. This was no longer simply a matter of pride or appearances. If Lord Carrow succeeded in casting doubt on Alastair's ability to manage his own home, the consequences could reach far beyond a single awkward dinner. The very household she had spent the last several days trying to hold together could be taken out of the Duke's hands entirely. Then we will show him a household running exactly as it should, Eleanor said, straightening her shoulders. Gather the senior staff, all of them. We begin within the hour. What followed was 6 days unlike anything Eleanor had experienced even during the busiest seasons at her aunt's inn. The house needed cleaning from its highest rafters to its lowest cellar. The kitchens, still divided by old rivalries, needed to produce meals fit for guests of standing, using supplies that had been mismanaged for years. And the 50 servants, only just beginning to trust her leadership, needed to move as one unified force rather than the scattered, feuding groups she had inherited less than a week before. The first crisis struck on the 2nd day, when Mrs. Whitfield discovered that half the stores of flour and preserved goods meant to last through the coming month had gone missing from the cellar, seemingly overnight. Someone has taken them, Mrs. Whitfield said, her hands trembling slightly as she surveyed the nearly empty shelves. Or sold them off before you arrived, Miss Hartwell, and hoped no one would notice until it was too late to fix. Eleanor felt a cold flash of anger, quickly replaced by focus. There was no time to hunt down whoever had caused the shortage, not with guests arriving in 4 days and a kitchen that needed to feed a household of 50+ visiting nobility. She needed supplies, and she needed them quickly. The Whitmore farm, Mrs. Whitfield offered hesitantly. 2 hours' ride from here. They have supplied this house before in better years, but the Duke has not settled an old debt with them, and I do not know if they would extend credit again. Then I will go and ask myself, Eleanor said. She rode out that same afternoon, borrowing a horse from the stables despite having little experience riding such distances, determined not to let pride or discomfort slow her down. The rain that had greeted her on her first arrival returned in force, turning the road to mud and slowing her journey considerably. By the time she reached the Whitmore farm, she was soaked through and exhausted, but she did not hesitate before knocking on the farmhouse door. The farmer, a weathered man named William Whitmore, listened to her request with obvious skepticism, arms crossed over his chest. The Duke owes my family for goods delivered near 2 years past, he said. I have little reason to extend more credit to a house that has not settled its debts. I am not asking you to forget what is owed, Eleanor said, standing firm despite the rain still dripping from her coat. I am asking you to trust that it will be paid, along with whatever new supplies you can offer now. I have reworked the estate's accounts myself this past week. The wages are being paid properly again, for the first time in longer than anyone there can remember. I intend to see the old debts settled the same way. But I need your help to do it before important guests arrive who could take the entire household away from the Duke's control if they find it wanting. William studied her for a long moment, rain drumming against the farmhouse roof. You rode 2 hours in a storm for this. I did. That is either very brave or very foolish, Miss Hartwell. Perhaps it is both, Elinor said, but I would rather try and fail than not try at all. Something in her determination seemed to reach him where her words alone had not. William agreed to supply what the estate needed immediately, on the promise that the old debt and the new goods would be settled together within the month, a promise Elinor made without hesitation, resolving privately that she would find a way to keep it no matter what it took. She returned to Raythorn Hall well after dark, exhausted and soaked to the bone, only to find a second crisis waiting for her. Mrs. Prout met her at the door, expression tight with worry rather than her usual sharpness. There has been talk among some of the staff, Miss Hartwell. Talk about your background. Someone has been telling the upstairs maids that you come from nothing, that your father is deeply in debt, that you tricked your way into this position through a clever letter rather than any real skill. If such talk reaches Lord Carrow's ears during his visit, he will use it against the Duke without hesitation. A Duke who chooses a housekeeper of low birth to manage his estate, on the verge of marrying her besides, will seem like further proof of poor judgment in Carrow's eyes. Elinor felt exhaustion give way to a sharper, colder feeling. Who is spreading this? I do not know for certain, Mrs. Prout admitted, though I have my suspicions. There are those among the staff who resent how quickly you have gained favor, who fear what changes you might bring to positions they have held comfortably for years. Elinor thought immediately of the head steward, Mr. Farrow, a man who had said little to her since her arrival, but watched her with an expression she had not been able to read. She thought too of a handful of upstairs maids who had seemed cool toward her from the very first day, resistant to any change in the household's old, uneven ways. It does not matter who started it, Elinor said finally, pushing the thought aside for now. We have 4 days until Lord Carrow arrives, supplies now secured, and a household still needing to be brought into proper order. Whatever is said about my birth will matter far less if this house runs as it should when he walks through that door. She did not sleep more than a few hours that night, rising before dawn to oversee the unloading of the supplies from the Whitmore farm, and to begin organizing the kitchens for the days ahead. Mrs. Whitfield, impressed by Elinor's efforts on her behalf, threw herself into the preparations with a renewed energy that spread quickly to the rest of the kitchen staff. Even Peter, the young hall boy, found himself trusted with tasks of real responsibility for the first time, carrying messages and organizing supplies with a pride that had been missing from his work before. It was on the 3rd day of preparations that Alastair found Elinor in the courtyard, overseeing the delivery of freshly cut firewood, while simultaneously settling a dispute between 2 footmen over who would be responsible for greeting the guests upon arrival. I heard about the ride to the Whitmore farm, he said. Once the footmen had gone their separate ways, their argument resolved. It needed doing, Elinor said simply, not looking up from the ledger she was reviewing. You could have been hurt, riding 2 hours in that storm. Something in his voice made her look up then, and she found an expression on his face she had not seen before, something closer to genuine concern than the cold formality he usually maintained. I was not hurt, she said, and the supplies arrived in time. That is what matters. That is not all that matters, he said quietly. I would not wish harm to come to you over the state of this house, Miss Hartwell. Whatever else is true between us, I would not wish that. Elinor felt something shift in her chest at his words, something she did not have time to examine closely with so much work still ahead of them. Thank you, Your Grace. I will try to be more careful next time, though I suspect there may be a next time, given the state we found this house in. For the first time since her arrival, he almost smiled, a small, brief thing that vanished as quickly as it appeared, but Elinor found herself thinking about it long after he had walked away. The 4th day brought word that the talk about her background had reached beyond the servants' quarters, whispered now among tradesmen who visited the estate for deliveries, the kind of gossip that traveled fast once it left the confines of a single household. Elinor forced herself not to dwell on it, focusing instead on the tasks still ahead. The dining hall needed proper arrangement. The guest quarters, unused for years, needed thorough cleaning and airing. The gardens, overgrown and neglected, needed at least the appearance of care before visiting eyes could judge them. By the fifth day, exhaustion had settled into every corner of Aliner's body, but the house had been transformed in ways that even Mrs. Prout, still cautious in her praise, could not deny. "I did not think it possible," Mrs. Prout admitted quietly, standing in the newly polished entrance hall on the evening before Lord Caro's arrival. 5 days, and this house looks more like itself than it has in years." "We are not finished yet," Aliner said, though a flicker of pride warmed her exhausted chest at the older woman's words. "Tomorrow will decide whether all of this was enough." That night, as the household finally settled into a fragile, well-earned rest, Aliner stood alone in the entrance hall, looking up at the grand staircase and the portraits lining the walls above it, wondering if 6 days of frantic effort would truly be enough to protect the Duke's home. And increasingly, though she barely admitted it even to herself, the Duke himself, from the storm that was set to arrive with the morning light. Lord Edmund Caro arrived precisely at noon, his carriage rolling through the gates with the kind of unhurried confidence that belonged to a man who expected to find exactly the disorder he had come looking for. Aliner watched from an upstairs window as he stepped down, followed by 2 guests whose names she had only read in the earlier letter, a Lady Margaret and her husband, both of them surveying the front of Raythorn Hall with expressions of polite curiosity that did little to hide their true purpose. She descended to join Alistair at the entrance, smoothing the front of her dress, aware of her own racing heart despite the calm composure she forced onto her face. "Whatever happens today," Alistair said quietly, just before the guests reached the door, "know that this house looks better than it has in a decade because of what you have done this past week." Aliner met his eyes briefly. "Let us hope Lord Caro agrees with you, Your Grace." The greetings that followed were polite on the surface, though Aliner did not miss the way Edmund's gaze swept over every detail of the entrance hall, searching for cracks in the newly polished surface. He complimented the cleanliness of the floors in a tone that suggested surprise rather than genuine praise, and asked pointed questions about the household staff that seemed designed to catch Aliner in some contradiction or gap in her knowledge. She answered each question directly, without hesitation, drawing on the detailed notes she had taken over the past week to speak with confidence about every aspect of the estate's management. Edmund's expression grew subtly less satisfied with each answer that failed to reveal the disorder he had clearly expected to find. The true test came at dinner, when the entire household staff worked in careful coordination to present a meal that reflected the estate's renewed order. Mrs. Whitfield had outdone herself with the supplies secured from the Whitmore farm, and the footmen, coached patiently by Aliner over the previous days, moved through their duties with a precision that would have seemed impossible only a week before. It was during the second course that the first attempt at sabotage revealed itself. A young upstairs maid, one Aliner recognized as among those who had seemed cool toward her since her arrival, deliberately allowed a serving dish to tilt as she passed near Lady Margaret's seat, sending a small portion of sauce spilling dangerously close to the guest's fine dress. Only quick reflexes from Beatrice, standing nearby and anticipating exactly such a moment given the tension she had sensed building all week, allowed her to catch the dish before real damage was done. Aliner caught the maid's eye across the room, and though nothing was said in that moment, the girl's guilty flush confirmed everything Aliner needed to know about who among the staff still hoped to see her fail. "A near miss," Lord Caro observed lightly, though his eyes lingered a moment too long on Aliner, as though testing whether she would crumble under even this small crisis. Households under strain often show their cracks in such small moments. Would you not agree, Miss Hartwell? "I would agree," Aliner said evenly, "that any household, however well run, occasionally sees a servant have an unsteady moment. What matters is how quickly such moments are corrected, and how little disruption they cause to those they might have affected. I do not believe Lady Margaret's dress suffered any lasting harm." Lady Margaret, glancing down at her still clean gown, offered a small, genuine laugh. Indeed it did not. I have seen far worse disasters at dinners run by households, with twice the staff and half the composure shown here tonight. Edmund's expression tightened almost imperceptibly at his guest's unintended praise, and Alina allowed herself a small measure of quiet satisfaction. The rest of the dinner passed without further incident, the conversation turning eventually to matters of the estate's finances, where Alina spoke plainly about the wage reform she had implemented and the new arrangement with the Whitmore farm to settle old debts. Edmund pressed hard on these points, clearly hoping to expose some weakness in her understanding of the household's true financial state. But Alina's careful work over the previous days meant she could answer every question with the kind of precise detail that left little room for doubt. It was only after the guests had retired for the evening, the immediate danger of the dinner behind them, that the second and more personal attack arrived. Alina found Alistair in his study, going over correspondence by candlelight, his expression troubled in a way that had nothing to do with the success of the dinner itself. "Edmund cornered me privately, after you had gone to check on the kitchen staff," he said, setting down the letter in his hand. "He has heard the rumors about your background, Alina. He suggested, not so subtly, that a duke marrying so far beneath his station, to a woman with debts of her own family hanging over her, would only confirm every doubt already circulating about my judgment." Alina felt her stomach tighten, though she kept her voice steady. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him," Alistair said, meeting her eyes directly, "that this house has run better in the past week under Miss Hartwell's management than it has in the 10 years since I inherited it, and that her birth has nothing to do with her evident capability. I told him that whatever arrangement I choose to make regarding my own household is not his concern, however much he might wish it were." Something warm and unexpected moved through Alina's chest at his words, a feeling she did not have the luxury of examining too closely with a household still full of guests to manage. "Thank you, Your Grace." "Alistair," he said quietly, "I think, after everything you have done this week, you might call me by my name, at least when we are alone." Alina allowed herself a small smile, the first genuine one she had permitted herself in days. "Alistair, then." They sat together for a while in comfortable silence, the candle burning low between them, neither feeling any particular urge to fill the quiet with conversation. It was Alina who eventually broke it, her curiosity from the past week finally overcoming her caution. "May I ask you something, and trust that you will answer honestly?" Alistair's expression grew guarded, though he nodded. "You may ask." "The old kitchen in the West Wing. I know it belonged to the late Duchess, and I know you have kept it sealed since her passing. I do not ask to disturb your grief, Alistair, but I have seen how much this house needs a heart, something beyond ledgers and wages, something that reminds 50 servants why they are working toward more than simply avoiding punishment. I believe that kitchen could be that heart again, if you allowed it." His face closed immediately, the warmth of moments before vanishing like a candle snuffed out. "I have told you already, Alina, that room is not open for discussion." "I only meant—" "I know what you meant," he said, his voice sharper than she had heard it since her arrival. "But you did not know her. You do not understand what that room means, what it cost me, and I will not have it treated as simply another problem for you to solve with your ledgers and your clever solutions." Alina felt the sting of his words, though beneath the sharpness she recognized something else entirely, a wound so deep that even the suggestion of touching it caused real pain. "I am sorry," she said quietly. "I did not mean to cause you distress, I only wished to help." His expression softened slightly, guilt replacing the sharpness of a moment before. "I know. I am sorry as well for speaking so harshly. It is a subject I have never learned to discuss calmly, even after all this time." "Then we will not discuss it further tonight," Alina said, rising from her chair. "You have a household still full of guests, and tomorrow will bring its own challenges. Good night, Alistair." She left him there in the candlelight, his eyes following her toward the door with an expression she could not quite name, somewhere between regret and something that looked almost like longing. Walking back through the quiet corridors toward her own room, Elinor found herself passing the west wing once more, the sealed door standing silent and dark at the end of its long hallway. She did not stop this time, did not linger the way she had on her first night in the house. But she carried the memory of Alistair's guarded pain with her, and she resolved once more firmly than before, that she would find a way to help him open that door, not because it was a problem to be managed, but because she had begun to care, more deeply than she had expected to, about the man standing on the other side of it. Lord Carrow did not leave the following morning as expected. Instead, he informed Alistair over breakfast that he intended to extend his stay by another week, citing a wish to observe the household's management more thoroughly before reporting back to the wider family. Elinor understood immediately what this truly meant. One successful dinner had not been enough to satisfy him. He intended to watch and wait, for the cracks he was still certain must exist somewhere beneath the surface. The extended visit brought new pressures Elinor had not fully anticipated. Edmund made a habit of appearing unannounced in different parts of the house, questioning servants directly rather than through Elinor, clearly hoping to catch someone off guard with an honest complaint that could be used against the household's management. He visited the accounts office uninvited, requesting to review the ledgers himself, and though Elinor had nothing to hide in the careful records she had kept, the constant scrutiny wore at everyone's nerves. It was during one such unannounced visit, 3 days into Edmund's extended stay, that he made a discovery Elinor had not anticipated at all. She found him standing in the corridor outside the west wing, one hand resting against the sealed door, an expression of calculating interest on his face that made her stomach turn cold. An entire room, sealed and unused, in a house that claims to be so carefully managed, Edmund said, not turning as she approached. How curious, Miss Hartwell. What exactly is behind this door that the Duke feels the need to hide from his own household? It is a private matter belonging to the family, Elinor said carefully. Not one that concerns the management of the estate. Everything concerns the management of an estate, Miss Hartwell, when that estate's future is in question. He finally turned to face her, his expression unpleasant. A locked room, kept secret for a decade. I wonder what the wider family might make of such a thing when they learn of it. Grief is understandable. But a duke who cannot even open a single door in his own home, who devotes his household's efforts to managing appearances rather than facing his own past honestly, hardly seems like a man fit to be trusted with an entire estate's future. Elinor felt anger rise sharply in her chest, though she forced herself to remain composed. The Duke's private grief is not a matter for judgment, Lord Carrow, and certainly not a matter that reflects on his ability to manage this household. I would ask that you respect the boundary he has set, as I have respected it myself. You misunderstand me, Miss Hartwell. I do not care about his grief. I care about what such a secret might suggest to those who already question his judgment. A locked door makes for a very convincing story, whatever the truth behind it might actually be. He offered her a thin smile before walking away, leaving Elinor standing alone in the corridor, dread settling heavily in her chest. She found Alistair in his study that same evening and relayed the conversation exactly as it had happened, watching his expression darken with each word. He means to use it against me, Alistair said quietly, once she had finished. Whatever is behind that door, real or imagined, he will twist it into proof that I cannot be trusted with my own home. Then perhaps, Elinor said carefully, it is time the truth behind that door stopped being a mystery for him to exploit. Alistair was silent for a long moment, staring at nothing in particular, his hands clasped tightly together on the desk before him. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than Elinor had ever heard it. Isabel loved that kitchen more than any other room in this house, he said. She was raised in a family with far less wealth than mine, much like yourself, and she never lost her love of simple, honest work, even after she became a duchess. She spent hours there every week, teaching the cooks new recipes, laughing with the kitchen staff in a way I never quite managed myself. I used to tease her gently about it, tell her that a duchess had no business smelling of flour and butter. She would only laugh and tell me that a house without warmth in its kitchen was no true home at all, whatever grand halls surrounded it. Elinor listened quietly, sensing that he needed to speak without interruption, the words clearly long overdue for release. She fell ill very suddenly, he continued. A fever that came on within a single day and took her within a week. I was traveling on a state business when it happened, 3 days away by carriage. By the time word reached me and I returned, she was already gone. I never had the chance to say goodbye to her, Elinor. I never had the chance to tell her how much that kitchen, and everything she brought to this house through it, meant to me. I ordered it sealed the day I returned, because I could not bear to walk past it and see it empty of her laughter. I told myself I would open it again eventually, once the grief had eased. It never has. You blame yourself, Elinor said softly, for not being here. I blame myself for many things, Alastair said, his voice rough with an emotion he had clearly kept buried for a decade. For traveling when I might have stayed. For not noticing sooner how quickly she was failing. For sealing away the one place that truly held her memory, rather than finding some way to honor it properly. I have spent 10 years managing an estate I could barely bring myself to care for, because caring for it meant facing everything I lost the day she died. Elinor rose from her chair and moved closer, kneeling beside him so their eyes were level. Alastair, listen to me. You did not cause her illness by being away on business that was surely necessary for this very estate you have struggled to protect ever since. Grief convinces us of terrible things about ourselves that are rarely true. I have watched you these past weeks. I have seen how deeply you care for this household, even when you did not know how to show it properly. That kitchen does not need to stay a tomb to honor her memory. It could become something far better, a place where her love of warmth and simple work lives on, rather than a room that only reminds this house of loss. Alastair looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, a decade of carefully guarded grief beginning, slowly, to loosen its grip. I do not know if I have the strength to open that door myself, he admitted quietly. Then let me open it, Elinor said. Not to erase her memory, Alastair, but to honor it properly, the way she would have wanted her kitchen to be used. Let me bring it back to life, for this household and perhaps in time for you as well. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Elinor began to fear she had asked too much, pushed too hard against a wound that was not yet ready to be touched. But then Alastair reached into the drawer of his desk, withdrew a small iron key she had never seen before, and placed it carefully into her open palm. Be gentle with what you find in there, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. It has been waiting a very long time. Elinor closed her fingers around the key, feeling its weight settle into her hand like something far heavier than simple metal. I will treat it with all the care it deserves, Alastair. I promise you that. He nodded, though his eyes remained fixed on the key in her hand, as though watching a decade of guarded grief finally begin, however slowly, to release its hold on him. Neither of them spoke of Edmund's threats again that evening, though both understood clearly that the coming days would demand more than simply opening a locked door. They would need to transform whatever lay behind it into proof, real and undeniable, that Raythorn Hall was not a house sinking under the weight of hidden shame, but one rising, piece by careful piece, into something worthy of the family name it carried. Elinor left the study that night with the key held carefully in her pocket, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and quiet reverence for what she was about to uncover. Whatever waited behind that sealed door, she understood now that it was far more than simply an abandoned kitchen. It was the last living piece of a woman this house had loved and lost, and it was, perhaps, the key to healing a decade of grief that had held both a household and its duke frozen in place for far too long. Tomorrow she would open the door. The key turned in the lock with a groan of metal that had not moved in 10 years, and for a moment Elinor simply stood there, hand resting on the old wooden door, gathering the courage to push it open. Beatrice stood beside her, having insisted on accompanying Elinor for this moment, unwilling to let her face whatever waited alone. Mrs. Whitfield had come as well, drawn by a quiet curiosity she had carried since the day she first heard the old kitchen mentioned, having never once been permitted inside during her years working the estate's active kitchen instead. Elinor pushed the door open, and a thick layer of dust stirred into the pale morning light spilling through the corridor windows behind them. The room that revealed itself took her breath away, not because of its grandeur, but because of exactly how untouched it had remained. Copper pots hung from hooks along one wall, dulled now with a decade of neglect, but still bearing the careful shine of a kitchen once lovingly maintained. A large wooden table stood at the center of the room, its surface marked with the small scars of years of chopping and kneading, evidence of countless hours of honest work performed by hands that clearly loved what they were doing. Herbs, long dried and faded, still hung from the ceiling beams in neat bundles, exactly as someone had left them a decade before, never to be used again. "It is exactly as she left it," Beatrice whispered, stepping carefully into the room as though afraid to disturb something sacred. "I remember this table. I remember watching her work at it, when I was newly hired and too shy to speak to a duchess directly." Elinor moved further into the room, running her fingers gently along the edge of the old wooden table, feeling the small grooves and marks left behind by years of careful work. Near the back of the kitchen, tucked onto a shelf beside a row of dusty jars, she found a leather-bound book, its cover worn soft with handling. She opened it carefully and found page after page of recipes written in careful, looping handwriting, each one accompanied by small personal notes in the margins. A note beside a bread recipe read simply, "This one always makes Alistair smile, even when he pretends not to notice." Another, beside a recipe for a rich vegetable stew, read, "Good for cold days when the whole staff needs warming. Make extra for the stable hands who work through every kind of weather without complaint." Elinor felt tears gather unexpectedly in her eyes as she read through page after page, understanding more clearly with each entry exactly what kind of woman had once filled this kitchen with warmth. Isabel had not simply cooked for herself or for grand occasions. She had cooked for her household, thought of her servants by name, considered their comfort in every recipe she wrote down. This was not the private hobby of a bored noblewoman. This had been an act of genuine care for everyone under her roof. "She truly loved this place," Mrs. Whitfield said quietly, looking around at the untouched kitchen with an expression of deep respect. "And everyone in it." "Then we will bring it back," Elinor said, closing the recipe book gently and holding it against her chest. "Not as a memorial to be dusted occasionally and left silent again, as a living place exactly the way she intended it." Word spread quickly through the household that the old kitchen had finally been opened, and by that same afternoon, servants who had worked at Raythorn Hall long enough to remember the Duchess personally began arriving quietly, almost reverently, to see the space with their own eyes. Many of them shared small memories with Elinor as they worked, stories of the Duchess laughing over a burnt loaf of bread, or patiently teaching a nervous young cook how to properly season a stew, each memory adding another piece to the picture of the woman whose absence had shaped this house for so long. Restoring the kitchen properly took the better part of 2 weeks, worked around the ongoing demands of managing the rest of the household and the continued watchful presence of Lord Carow, who observed the sudden activity in the West Wing with obvious suspicion, but found, to his evident frustration, nothing scandalous to report about it. Quite the opposite, in fact. Word of the kitchen's restoration only added to the sense, spreading even among his own traveling companions, that Raythorn Hall was a house healing rather than declining under its current management. Elinor recruited Mrs. Whitfield to help identify the estate's most skilled cooks, drawing them away from their usual duties for portions of each day to help restore the old equipment and begin testing recipes from the Duchess's careful notes. Peter, the young hall boy, proved surprisingly talented at scrubbing the old copper pots back to their original shine, taking evident pride in work that finally felt meaningful rather than simply exhausting. Even Mrs. Prout, after days of watching the transformation from a careful distance, eventually offered her own quiet contribution, mentioning details about the Duchess's preferences that only someone who had served the house for many years would have remembered. She always insisted the windows stay open while baking, Mrs. Prout said one afternoon, watching as fresh bread rose on the counter for the first time in a decade. Said the whole house should smell of it, not just the kitchen. Thought it made everyone feel like the work was for them, not just for her own table. Elinor smiled at that, and immediately had the kitchen windows thrown open wide, letting the scent of fresh bread drift out into the corridors and beyond, exactly as Isabelle had once intended. It was on the 10th day of the restoration, with the kitchen nearly returned to its former warmth, that Alastair finally came to see it himself. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking in the transformation, his expression unreadable as his eyes moved slowly across the room, taking in the polished copper pots, the freshly scrubbed table, the warm smell of bread still lingering from the morning's work. Elinor watched him carefully, uncertain whether she had made a terrible mistake in pushing so hard toward this moment. "It smells like her," he said finally, his voice thick with an emotion he made no effort to hide. "I had forgotten how much this room used to smell exactly like this." He walked further inside, his fingers trailing gently across the old wooden table, exactly as Elinor's had done on the first day the door was opened. When he reached the shelf where the recipe book had rested, he paused, and Elinor stepped forward to hand it to him gently, having kept it safe throughout the restoration. He opened it slowly, reading a few of the entries with an expression that shifted from pain to something softer, something almost like peace, as he recognized her handwriting, her small personal notes scattered throughout the pages. "She wrote that I smile at her bread," he said quietly, reading the note Elinor had discovered on her very first day in the room. "I never told her that. I never told her most of what I felt, Elinor. I assumed there would always be more time." "There rarely is," Elinor said gently, "as much time as we assume we have. But her love for this house and for you clearly did not depend on whether every word was spoken aloud. It lived in every recipe she wrote for the comfort of the people around her. It lives here still in this room, waiting for exactly this moment." Alastair looked up at her, something in his expression shifting entirely, 10 years of carefully guarded grief finally beginning to soften into something that looked, for the first time since Elinor had arrived at Raythorn Hall, almost like hope. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for not letting me leave this room sealed away forever. I do not think I would have found the courage to open it myself, not without you standing beside me through it." "You do not have to thank me," Elinor said. "This house needed its heart back. I only helped it find the way." That evening, for the first time in a decade, the entire household gathered in the newly restored kitchen for a shared evening meal, prepared from Isabelle's own recipes by the combined efforts of every cook on the estate. 50 servants who had spent weeks divided by old rivalries and long-standing grudges sat together at long tables set up throughout the space, sharing food and easy conversation, in a way that Elinor suspected had not happened at Raythorn Hall in longer than anyone still working there could properly remember. Alastair sat among them, not at some distant head table set apart from his staff, but among the long tables themselves, sharing bread that had been baked using his late wife's own careful recipe, surrounded by the warmth and laughter of a household finally beginning to feel, once again, like a true home. Lord Carow, observing the gathering from a careful distance, said nothing that evening, though the calculating suspicion that had colored his expression since his arrival had shifted, subtly, into something closer to grudging surprise. Whatever story he had come to Raythorn Hall hoping to uncover, it was clear to everyone present that the truth he had actually found was something far different, and far harder to use against the Duke than the neglect and disorder he had originally expected. Elinor watched it all from a quiet corner of the room, the recipe book still resting safely on a shelf nearby, and felt, for the first time since her frantic arrival weeks before, that Raythorn Hall had finally begun to heal, one shared meal, one restored memory at a time. Lord Carow finally announced his departure the following morning, though the manner of his leaving carried none of the quiet acceptance Alina had hoped for after the warmth of the previous evening. He found her alone in the estate office, reviewing accounts before the day's work began, and closed the door behind him before speaking. "You have done something remarkable here, Miss Hartwell," he said, his tone carrying no genuine admiration despite the words themselves. "I will admit that freely. This household runs better than I have seen it in years, and that kitchen, whatever sentiment drove its restoration, has clearly won you a great deal of loyalty among the staff." "Thank you, Lord Carrow," Alina said carefully, sensing that his true purpose in seeking her out had not yet been revealed. "But loyalty among servants and genuine standing in society are very different matters," he continued. "You may have convinced this household that you belong here, Miss Hartwell, but you have not convinced the wider family, and you certainly have not convinced society at large. A vicar's daughter with debts hanging over her family name, managing a duke's household, and, I understand, soon to marry him besides. Do you truly believe such an arrangement will be accepted quietly, once word spreads beyond these walls? I have not concerned myself with what society believes, Lord Carrow. I have concerned myself with running this household properly, and I believe I have done exactly that." "For now," Edmund said, his tone turning colder. "But there is a gathering planned at the end of this month, a harvest celebration that draws much of the wider family and their connections to this estate every year without fail. I intend to attend, Miss Hartwell, and I intend to bring with me certain details about your family's financial history that I have taken the trouble to investigate these past weeks. Details, I suspect, that Alistair does not fully know himself." Alina felt cold dread settle into her stomach. "What details do you mean?" "Your father's debts run deeper than simple hardship, Miss Hartwell. I have learned that a portion of what your family owes stems from decisions your father made that were, shall we say, less than honest in their dealings with certain creditors. Nothing criminal, perhaps, but nothing that would reflect well on a woman hoping to marry into a duke's household either. Society forgives poverty far more easily than it forgives even the suggestion of dishonesty in a family's past." "My father's mistakes are not mine to answer for," Alina said, though her voice trembled slightly despite her effort to remain composed. "Perhaps not in a fairer world. But this is the world we actually live in, Miss Hartwell, and I intend to make sure the wider family understands exactly what kind of woman Alistair intends to marry, before that marriage becomes impossible to undo. Whether he chooses to proceed despite the scandal that follows is, of course, entirely his decision. But I doubt his standing, or this estate's reputation, will survive such a revelation without lasting damage." He left the office without waiting for her response, leaving Alina alone with the ledgers spread before her, and a cold, creeping fear that had nothing to do with wages or supplies, and everything to do with a past she had never fully examined herself. She found her father's most recent letters that evening, searching through them for any hint of what Edmund might have discovered, and found, buried among his usual apologetic updates about his health and their family's finances, a brief mention of a business partner from years before, a man her father had trusted with an investment that had failed disastrously, leaving debts that some in their small community had whispered quietly might not have been entirely honest in how they were structured. Alina had never pressed her father for details, focused instead on simply managing the practical consequences of whatever mistakes had been made. Now, faced with the possibility that those old mistakes might be used to destroy everything she had built at Raythorn Hall, she felt the full weight of a past she had never fully understood settling heavily upon her. She did not sleep well that night, and the following days passed in a haze of anxious preparation as the harvest celebration drew steadily closer. She continued her work managing the household, overseeing the ongoing use of the restored kitchen, settling the small disputes that still occasionally arose among the staff. But a part of her mind remained constantly occupied with Edmund's threat, and the fear of what its fulfillment might mean, not just for herself, but for Alistair and everything they had built together these past weeks. She debated telling him directly, weighing the risk of him hearing it first from Edmund's own mouth, dressed in whatever damaging light his cousin chose to present it, against the discomfort of raising the subject herself before she fully understood the truth of her father's past dealings. In the end, it was Beatrice who convinced her to speak honestly. "He trusted you enough to open that kitchen, Miss Hartwell," Beatrice said gently, as they worked together preparing linens one quiet afternoon. "A trust like that deserves honesty in return, whatever the truth turns out to be. Better he hears it from you, in your own words, than twisted through Lord Caro's mouth in front of the whole family." Elinor found Alastair that same evening in his study and told him everything: Edmund's threat, her father's uncertain business dealings from years before, her own fear of what the coming celebration might bring. She watched his expression carefully as she spoke, bracing herself for disappointment, or worse, the cold withdrawal she had witnessed from him during their very first conversation weeks before. Instead, when she finished, he reached across the desk and took her hand gently in his own. "Do you believe your father acted with genuine dishonesty?" he asked, "or simply made a poor decision that others have since twisted into something worse than it truly was?" "I do not know for certain," Elinor admitted. "I have never had the full details myself, but I know my father, Alastair. Whatever mistake he made, I do not believe it came from any desire to deceive anyone." "Then that is enough for me," Alastair said firmly. "Edmund has spent this entire visit searching desperately for some flaw to exploit, some crack in this household's foundation he could use to prove his own judgment superior to mine. He found none in how you have managed this estate, and I will not allow an old, uncertain mistake from your father's past to succeed where his own careful searching failed. He intends to speak of it publicly, Alastair, in front of the entire family. Then we will face it together, publicly, exactly as it happens," Alastair said. "I would rather stand beside you honestly through whatever difficulty arises than hide from a threat that has no true power over us unless we allow it to." Elinor felt tears gather in her eyes, though this time they came from relief rather than fear. "You truly mean that?" "I have never meant anything more clearly in my life," Alastair said, his voice steady and certain in a way she had not heard from him before. "Elinor, these past weeks have shown me more about what a true home can be than the previous 10 years combined. I will not let Edmund's petty scheming take that away, over a mistake that was never yours to begin with." The harvest celebration arrived on a clear, crisp evening at the end of the month. The grounds of Raythorn Hall transformed with lanterns and long tables set beneath the open sky, the entire household working together to prepare a celebration unlike anything the estate had seen in years. Members of the wider family arrived throughout the afternoon, along with Edmund himself, his expression carrying the same calculating confidence Elinor had come to recognize during his extended visit weeks before. He waited until the celebration was well underway, guests gathered comfortably around the long tables, before he rose and asked, with deliberate casualness, whether the family might like to hear certain details about the background of the woman soon to become their duchess. Elinor felt every eye in the gathering turn toward her, her heart pounding, though she forced herself to remain composed, exactly as she had during that very first tense dinner weeks before. Before Edmund could continue, Alastair rose from his own seat, standing tall before the assembled family with a calm certainty that silenced the gathering completely. "Before my cousin shares whatever tale he has gathered," Alastair said, his voice carrying easily across the gathered tables, "I would like to share something of my own with this family." Edmund's confident expression faltered slightly, clearly having expected a defensive response rather than this calm assertion of control. 10 years ago, I lost my wife, Isabel, to a sudden illness while I was away on estate business," Alastair continued, his voice steady despite the weight of the words. "In my grief, I sealed away the kitchen she loved most in this house, and I let much of this estate fall into quiet neglect, unable to face the daily reminders of everything I had lost. I imagine some of you noticed this decline over the years, even if none of you spoke of it directly to my face. Several members of the gathered family exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unprepared for this level of honesty from a man they had known primarily through his cold, distant reputation. Several weeks ago, Miss Alina Hartwell arrived at this estate, answering an advertisement I placed out of practical necessity rather than any hope of genuine partnership. Within moments of her arrival, she had already put out a kitchen fire that my own staff had panicked over. Within days, she had reformed a wage system that had left 50 servants underpaid and divided against one another for years. Within weeks, she had convinced me, gently and patiently, to finally open a door I had kept sealed for a decade. And in doing so, she helped restore not just a room, but the very heart of this household. He paused, looking directly at Edmund, whose expression had shifted from confidence to something closer to discomfort, as the gathered family listened with evident interest. I understand my cousin intends to share details of Miss Hartwell's father's financial troubles this evening, in hopes of proving that her presence here reflects poorly on this family's standing. I would ask this gathering to consider, instead, what I have witnessed with my own eyes these past weeks. A woman who rode 2 hours through a storm to secure supplies for this household when others had sabotaged our stores. A woman who faced down suspicion and cruelty from staff and family alike, and answered it not with anger, but with patient, undeniable competence. A woman who helped me finally honor my late wife's memory properly, rather than letting it remain sealed away in grief forever. He turned to face Alina directly now, his expression open in a way she had never seen from him before, vulnerable and certain all at once. Whatever mistakes her father may have made in matters entirely separate from her own character, I do not believe they diminish anything about the woman who has done more for this household, in a matter of weeks, than I managed in 10 years of quiet neglect. If this family cannot accept a duchess chosen for her genuine character rather than the size of her family's fortune, then I fear this family has lost sight of what actually matters in managing an estate, or a household, or indeed a life worth living. Silence held the gathering for a long moment, and Alina felt her heart pounding as she waited to see how the family would respond to such an open declaration. It was Lady Margaret, the same guest who had laughed genuinely during that first tense dinner weeks before, who finally broke the silence. I, for one, find nothing objectionable in a duke choosing genuine character over empty pedigree, she said clearly, her voice carrying easily across the gathered tables. I have visited many estates in my time, and I have rarely seen one run with the warmth and order I witnessed here these past weeks. If Edmund wishes to continue searching for scandal in matters of an old business dealing that has nothing to do with Miss Hartwell's own conduct, I fear he will find little support among the rest of us for such an effort. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathered family, and Alina watched Edmund's expression shift from calculated confidence to something closer to defeat, recognizing that whatever damaging story he had intended to tell had already been rendered powerless by Alastair's honest words, and by the evidence of the household's genuine transformation that every guest present had witnessed for themselves. Edmund said nothing further that evening, retreating from the gathering not long after, his plans for scandal having crumbled entirely against the simple, undeniable truth of what Alina had accomplished at Raythorn Hall. The celebration continued long into the evening, warmer and more genuine than it had begun, with Alastair remaining seated beside Alina rather than retreating into his usual careful distance from his guests. It was near the end of the evening, as the last of the family guests began preparing for their departure, that he led Alina quietly away from the gathering, back toward the west wing, toward the kitchen that had started this entire transformation. The room stood warm and softly lit in the evening light, the smell of fresh bread still lingering faintly from that morning's baking. Alastair stopped near the old wooden table, the same table where Isabel's recipe book still rested safely on its shelf, and turned to face Alina directly. "I did not ask you to marry me out of practical necessity tonight, Alina, though I know that is how this arrangement began between us," he said, his voice steady but carrying a warmth she had never heard from him before. I am asking you now because these past weeks have taught me what I had forgotten was possible, that a home can be filled with warmth and purpose again, that grief does not have to remain a locked door forever, and that a life built on genuine partnership is worth far more than one built on cold, practical arrangement alone. Alina felt tears gathering in her eyes as he continued, his hand reaching for hers exactly as it had during their conversation weeks before, when she had first told him of Edmund's threat. "I love you, Alina Hartwell," he said simply. "Not because you brought order to 50 servants, though you certainly did that. Not because you restored a kitchen I could not bear to face alone, though I will be grateful for that for the rest of my life. I love you because of who you are, patient and honest and braver than anyone I have ever known. Will you marry me truly as my partner in every sense, rather than simply the practical arrangement this began as?" Alina felt the weight of 10 years of grief, and weeks of quiet, careful work, and a lifetime of practical necessity, all giving way at once to something far warmer and far more certain than she had ever expected to find at the end of a simple advertisement in a village newspaper. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Alistair. I will marry you truly and gladly." He drew her into an embrace there in the warm kitchen, surrounded by the copper pots and the lingering smell of fresh bread, the recipe book resting safely nearby, as though Isabel herself stood witness to this moment, her own love for the house and its people finally living on through the very transformation Alina had helped bring about. Word of the engagement spread through the household before the following morning had even fully arrived, and the celebration that followed among the 50 servants who had come to know and respect Alina over these past weeks was, by every account, far warmer and more genuine than any grand society gathering could ever have been. Mrs. Prout, who had begun the arrangement as one of Alina's fiercest doubters, offered her congratulations with tears in her eyes, admitting quietly that she had not seen this house filled with such genuine hope since the days before Isabel's passing. Peter, the young hall boy who had found real purpose in scrubbing the old kitchen back to its former shine, was given the honor of ringing the estate's bell to announce the happy news, a task he performed with more enthusiasm than precision, but with a joy that spread quickly through every corner of Raythorn Hall. Beatrice, who had quietly guided Alina through so much of the household's hidden tensions over these past weeks, simply embraced her friend warmly, whispering that she had known, from that very first day when Alina smothered a kitchen fire without hesitation, that something remarkable had arrived at Raythorn Hall. As the household settled into a rare, contented quiet that evening, Alina stood once more in the restored kitchen, looking around at everything that had changed since her frantic arrival weeks before. 50 servants who had once been divided by old grudges now worked together as a genuine household. A duke who had spent a decade frozen in grief had finally found his way back to warmth and hope. And a kitchen that had stood sealed and silent for 10 years now stood open, warm, and full of life once again, exactly as its original mistress had always intended it to be. Raythorn Hall, Alina understood now, had never truly needed a wife capable of managing 50 servants alone. It had needed someone willing to bring its heart back to life, one honest effort at a time, and in doing so she had found not just a position, not just security for herself and her ailing father, but a genuine home and a genuine love that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. The wedding took place in early spring, in the gardens of Raythorn Hall rather than some grand cathedral in the city, a choice Alina and Alistair made together, wanting the day to reflect the genuine warmth they had built rather than empty grandeur for its own sake. The 50 servants who had once been divided by old rivalries stood together as honored guests rather than simply staff performing their duties, a decision that surprised the wider family but felt, to everyone who had lived through the transformation of the past months, exactly right. Alina's father, his health improved considerably once his debts had been quietly and fairly settled by the newly reorganized estate accounts, walked her down the garden path himself, tears in his eyes as he saw his daughter standing beside a man who looked at her with such open, genuine devotion. Whatever mistakes had shadowed their family's past, They no longer carried the weight they once had, settled honestly, and put finally to rest. Mrs. Prout, who had once doubted Alina at every turn, stood near the front of the gathered guests, her expression soft with a pride she had never expected to feel toward the young woman she had initially resented. In the months since the engagement, she had become one of Alina's most trusted allies in managing the household. Her decades of experience combined with Alina's fresh energy, creating a partnership that served Raythorn Hall far better than either could have managed alone. Beatrice served as Alina's closest attendant that day, her quiet loyalty from those very first difficult weeks having grown into a genuine friendship that neither woman had expected when they first met over a pile of linens in an unfamiliar house. Peter, now given proper training as a junior steward rather than simply carrying whatever tasks no one else wanted, stood proudly among the household staff, having found in Alina's arrival the same chance at genuine purpose that had transformed so much of Raythorn Hall itself. Lord Caro did not attend the wedding, his standing among the wider family having diminished considerably following his failed attempt at scandal during the harvest celebration months before. Word had spread quietly through their family connections that his own management of his smaller estate left considerably more to be desired than anything he had attempted to find fault with at Raythorn Hall, and his influence, once considerable, had faded steadily into quiet irrelevance. Alina felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only a quiet relief that his efforts to harm what she and Alistair had built together had ultimately come to nothing. The kitchen that had started this entire transformation remained, in the months and years that followed, exactly what Alina had promised it would become, a living heart for the household rather than a quiet memorial gathering dust. Isabel's recipe book found a permanent place on its shelf, its pages growing steadily fuller as Alina added her own recipes alongside the late Duchess's careful notes, creating something that honored the past while continuing steadily to grow. Every servant on the estate, from the newest hall boy to the most senior steward, knew they were welcome to share a meal there, and the daily gathering for supper became, over time, the household's most treasured tradition, a moment when 50 individuals, regardless of position or duty, sat together as one genuine family. Alistair, who had spent a decade managing his estate from behind the cold distance of grief, found himself transformed as thoroughly as the household around him. He took to visiting the kitchen most mornings, sometimes simply to sit quietly with a cup of tea while Alina worked, other times joining in the preparation itself, with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone who remembered the withdrawn man he had been before her arrival. He spoke of Isabel more freely now, sharing small memories with the staff who had known her, keeping her spirit genuinely alive rather than sealed away behind a locked door, exactly as Alina had hoped he eventually would. Within 2 years, Raythorn Hall had earned a reputation throughout the wider family, and indeed throughout much of the county, as one of the best managed and most genuinely happy estates in the region, a remarkable turnaround from the quiet decline it had suffered through for the decade before Alina's arrival. Visitors who came expecting the cold, withdrawn duke of old reputation found instead a household warm with laughter, efficient in its management, and clearly devoted to both its duke and the woman who had transformed his home so completely. Alina never forgot the frantic chaos of her very first hour at Raythorn Hall, smothering a kitchen fire with nothing but quick instinct and a woolen cloth before she had even properly introduced herself. She often reflected, in quiet moments in the restored kitchen she had come to love as deeply as her own family, that this single small crisis had set the pattern for everything that followed, a household in genuine need of someone willing to face its problems directly rather than from a safe, comfortable distance. She had come to Raythorn Hall seeking only practical security, a wage to support her ailing father, a roof that would not be taken from beneath her within the month. What she had found instead was a genuine home, a genuine partnership, and a genuine love that neither she nor Alistair had believed possible when their arrangement first began with nothing more than a bluntly worded advertisement, and a desperate need on both their parts for something more stable than what their lives had offered before. 50 servants had once stood divided at Raythorn Hall, feuding over unpaid wages and old grudges that had festered for years without anyone willing to address them honestly. Under Aliner's patient, determined leadership, they had become something far greater, a household united not simply by duty, but by genuine care for one another and for the home they all shared together. And at the heart of it all stood a kitchen once sealed away in grief, now warm with life, laughter, and the smell of fresh bread drifting steadily through every corner of Raythorn Hall, exactly as its original mistress had always intended, and exactly as the woman who revived it had promised it would become. From the very first moment she turned an iron key that had waited 10 long years to be opened again.